You tell me what the issue is, then I can tell you the kind of a model you want to look at. And I think any modeler will tell you that. So it's very important that you know that. Lots of people love to use models for forecasts. My experience has been, I actually have one great example I was going to show you, but I decided not to, of where we actually got it. It was right on. It was a beautiful projection, but for the most part, you really can't do very well on these oil price projections of a long-term nature. And so that's my view of it, but that isn't really what I find the most valuable thing. The most valuable thing about modeling is it should help you understand a problem. You should be able to put down the key elements of it, and if you understand the different behavioral parts of it, you can come up with a good story about why this thing is happening the way it is. And that's what I'm going to emphasize here. So I'm going to be emphasizing here kind of this, explaining these, the drivers in the oil market. And it could be any one of these types of models as we're moving ahead. So I guess there. So we have a couple new issues on the horizon. One of which is we know that the Asian market is growing much faster than all the other markets. We know it has a different configuration of the of oil products that's being demanded. And I'm seeing more and more people kind of thinking, well, maybe we should be developing a different kind of marketing strategy, different kind of approach to selling oil in this kind of a market than we are in other markets. And is that even possible, given that the fact that people are talking about this thing being a fungible market? But people are getting more and more interested in the regional detail of some of the models. And so the models are getting bigger for that particular aspect. They want to be able to pick up these opportunities to look at these issues. The second issue on is that consumers want lighter products in general, and they want it derived from denser and sourer crude types. If you take a look at the projections of the supply numbers coming out, and so as a result, we're putting new demands in on the refinery systems. And you might be in a situation where you're trying to define whether or not you want to build a refinery, or you may be worried about we've got this, what's the world going to look like when we're still being constrained by the lack of refining capacity? So I think that's another second issue. A third issue, I really see this OPEC members having diverse interests as being a really important issue. I think several people have mentioned it earlier today, but I really think that's going to be a fundamental issue. You know, back in the 70s, the models were really built by people who lived in OECD countries, and they were worried about how are we going to work around this big monolith called OPEC, and how can we devise our policies around it. Now I see people sort of saying, well, you know, that's too much of a simplification. And I also see people in individual producing countries who are saying, you know, this decision really isn't like us all in one big group. We have our own political interests, we have our own economic development interests, and as a result, people are starting to work with models that have a little more detail on what are the supply strategies that make sense for individual countries. So I see that as another way people will kind of develop these models. A fourth way I look at the information is on this climate change policy, and here I have to tell you, I see a huge gap between people working on oil market modeling and people working on climate change analysis. It's almost like you got the English department together with the physicists or something. I mean, it's really, there really is a gap there. And what I see on the oil market side, particularly if you get people who've thought about the oil market, they think a lot about things like production supply decision, but particularly the fact that a good hunk of the production is in regions that are looking for some degree of coordination, the OPEC countries, and this kind of a representation really doesn't get get picked up by the climate models that I've seen. The climate models are kind of this pure economic kind of, well, let's produce the amount of oil that's available at whatever the costs are. So that's a real problem. Well, on the other hand, I see in the oil market modeling a lot of emphasis being given to treating oil all by itself, a little lonesome thing. And don't bother me with the environmental and climate change implications, because that's too complicated an issue. I can tell you a lot about oil, but I can't tell you a lot about these other things. So if, to the extent we can develop some communication, I think it's going to help us a whole lot. Well, I'll make that comment later. So what I'm going to do now is just to go through very quickly on some of the issues that I have found. These are kind of issues that I think if you're trying to develop these models, you want to improve them in these areas. And I'm going to talk first about the demand side, then I'm going to talk about non-OPEC production, and then I'll say a few words about OPEC, although I think people have already kind of picked up a lot of the words I wanted to say already on that. One of the things I think we need to know, we really need to ask ourselves is we've got all kinds of studies out there on demand. Everybody, I mean, if you pick up a survey article and people will do 100 different papers that they've evaluated, and everyone's got their favorite form that they want to use, and it's all different from everyone else. I mean, it's got to be different. If it's not different, it's not going to get published. So that's one of the sad parts about it. So they've all done all these different things, but do any of these things really work? That's kind of a fundamental issue. And I'll just give you an example of some of the things that I've done, very limited on just on the U.S., but I think the same kind of thing could be done on a number of different countries and a number of different time periods, because ultimately you want to know how good your system is at tracking these trends. So what I did is basically put together a data set, and then I estimated a number of different models, each one different from the other. And then as of 2000 or thereabout, I locked it. I said, that's it. No changes in those models. And then I simply used information to carry it on forward and project from there, doing what they call a backcasting kind of exercise. So in other words, you're taking what the model says should happen in the years 2000 to 2010, and you're simply comparing that with what actually happened. And I wanted to get a long story in here because I was particularly interested in the longer run issues. And so that's basically what I did. And if you're into backcasting, this is what I call an endogenous backcast. It's one that every year you get a new value for consumption, then you go on and you evaluate, you put that into your model, and you continue that through. So you're trying to have the model do as much work as you can, and then you just compare the two. And when I do that, I'm rather struck by a few things. First of all, estimating the change in energy demand, or change in oil demand, excuse me, over this turbulent decade, you're better off estimating the change in the oil demand as a function of changes of all your other variables, rather than trying to estimate the levels. If the level of, in other words, you're estimating the change in oil consumption rather than estimating the level of oil demand. And if you do that under a certain set of conditions, which I'll describe as being, I think this might be the symmetry or the reversible thing that I think Dermot talked about before. That is that the price increases will have the same effect as price decreases, but just of the opposite sign. That's the way to think of that. If you do that, the change variables seem to work out much better. Now this really made me really kind of disturbed me at first, because I've always been trained to think about, well, these lagged, oil demand really takes a long time, and you really want to work with levels, you don't want to work in changes. And I think it has to do with the fact that it's really difficult to find in the US data a kind of a general long-run relationship between the levels of the variables that I was working with, and that's a problem. And so the changes do better than the levels. One of the equations that I did look at did much better than all the others, and that has this kind of irreversibility that Dermot talked about earlier, that price increases have a different effect than price decreases. It also has the important element that price changes that happened during like the 1970s are fundamentally different than price changes that have happened after that, or that may be happening here today. In other words, I call this transformative price increases. These are price increases that really fundamentally change not just how people drive, but it changes the capital stock and how efficient we want the engines to be. So if you use that, it works out great, except one caveat on that is some of these equations, using that kind of approach, don't work out very well, and it really has to do with whether or not you include not only the current levels of the variables, but what economists call the lag levels of the variables. And in essence, you need the lag levels of all the variables in the equation, as well as the current levels, and not just a few shortcuts. And a few of the shortcuts, for those who do econometrics, the quick distributed lag is extremely popular. That came out poorly. And unfortunately, so did the paper that, even though we won the award on this, the paper that Dermot and I did also didn't come out very well on this estimate. But if you are really careful about, so what it's saying is you got to be really careful putting in all the stuff that's really could potentially play out here, and you should be doing these kinds of things regularly if you want to try to improve your ability to look at these issues. A second issue has to do with, we know that oil demand has the potential to decrease over time. If you even holding constant prices and in GDP and a bunch of other variables, it tends to decrease over time